Honestly, Penelope, nobody wants you here. You should stay near the buffet.
The dress was horrible, and old fabric too. Penelope Sharman looked at her sister, Posey, who smiled venomously while holding the dress. "It's this, or you don't go," Posey said with fake sweetness. Penelope knew exactly what was happening. Another humiliation, another cruel game. Taylor, the middle sister, burst out, "Posey, this is ridiculous. She can't wear that." Posey turned cold. "Mom forced me to bring you two to my event, my career, my contacts. If Penelope wants to go, she'll wear what I picked, or stay home, and take off those earrings," she continued, pointing at Penelope's delicate earrings, "and that makeup, too flashy for someone who's just a +1. Taylor was furious, but Penelope touched her arm. "It's okay." But when her sister humiliated her at the party in front of everyone, saying nobody wanted her, it wasn't okay at all. But what Posey didn't know, Scott Ferrari, the man she'd always wanted, had been watching everything, and he loved revenge almost as much as he loved genuine women in simple dresses. So the night was about to get interesting. Hi, my name is Kay, and I'm the mind behind this channel. And today, I want to thank the comments from Charlotte and Evangeline. Thank you so much for commenting. Your support changes everything. And if you want your comment to show up in the next video, answer me real quick. What do you think about someone who tries to embarrass their own sister at an important event? Tell me here in the comments. Chapter 1. The Ugly Dress and the Humiliation.
If humiliation is your game, Posey, tonight you might have played the wrong move.
I was 16 when I realized my sister hated me, and the discovery happened in the cruelest way possible, with the captain of the football team asking me to his prom while Posey watched the entire scene from my bedroom doorway. The boy's name was Brandon, and he had blue eyes that sparkled when he smiled, and I had no idea that my older sister had spent the last 3 months flirting with him at every social event in our town that was too small for real secrets. When I declined Brandon's invitation with all the delicacy an insecure teenage girl could muster, saying I had too much studying to think about proms, Posey still looked at me like I'd ripped something vital from her chest and stomped on it in front of all our acquaintances. She didn't say anything that day, but the way she slammed her own bedroom door and spent 3 weeks ignoring me said everything I needed to understand about our relationship from that moment on. The pattern repeated so many times in the following years that I lost count, with different boys gravitating toward me while Posey watched from a distance with that cold look that pretended indifference, but bled resentment from every pore. I never asked for their attention, never flirted or used elaborate seduction tricks like my sister did with the precision of someone studying the subject like it was a college course. But something in my unpretentious naturalness seemed to attract exactly what she most wanted and could never keep. The jealousy grew over the years, settling between us like an invisible but undeniable third presence. And each new boy who chose to notice me instead of noticing her only fed the resentment Posey carried like second skin. Now, 8 years after that prom I never even went to, I was sitting in our mother's living room listening to Henrietta practically beg Posey to take us to the charity event happening the next day. Posey was 29 now, vice president of public relations at a luxury company that paid obscene salaries, and attended elite galas with the regularity of someone born for that world of expensive champagne and empty conversations about important causes. "Your family," Henrietta said, with that maternal firmness she rarely used, but when activated didn't accept arguments. "You need to do things together, create good memories. Posey, you're taking your sisters to the event, and you'll have fun like the family you are." Posey accepted with obvious reluctance, the forced smile barely hiding the irritation gleaming in her eyes. But I saw something more dangerous forming in her expression when she agreed. I'd known my sister long enough to recognize when she was planning something, and the way she looked at me before leaving Henrietta's house made alarms ring in my head. The next day, Posey showed up at the house where Taylor and I still lived with our mother, while we saved enough money to get our own apartment, and she was carrying a bag from an expensive store that immediately sparked my suspicion. "I brought you a present, Penelope," she announced in that sugary tone she only used when planning something particularly cruel. For tonight's event, the dress she pulled from the bag was the most hideous thing I'd ever seen in my entire life, and that included the gym uniform from the public school where I worked as a kindergarten teacher. It was brown, the exact color of dried mud mixed with dead hopes, with excessive ruffles that seemed to have survived from some 80s-themed party nobody should remember. And the fabric had that quality of cheap polyester that scratched just from looking at it and would probably cause skin rashes after prolonged contact. Taylor, who was sitting on the couch reviewing architecture projects, stood up so fast when she saw the dress that she knocked over the coffee cup that was on the coffee table. "Posey, "This is ridiculous," she said in the firm voice of someone used to dealing with impossible clients and insane deadlines, but still found limits of absurdity she wasn't willing to accept. "And Penelope can't wear this. It looks like an old curtain someone turned into a dress as punishment for crimes against humanity. Then she's not going," Posey responded with the coldness of someone discussing the weather, and not the deliberate humiliation of her own sister. And I saw the exact moment her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of having created the perfect trap. "Mom forced me to bring you two to my event, with my professional contacts and my reputation on the line. If Penelope wants to go, she'll wear what I chose. It's this, or she stays home. Her choice." I looked at the horrible dress in my sister's hands, and felt that familiar stab of humiliation, mixed with resignation that had become the texture of our relationship over the years. The rational part of my brain screamed for me to refuse, to tell Posey to go to a very specific place and spend the night reading a good book in the company of my cats. But when I thought of Henrietta's excited expression earlier, talking about her 3 daughters going out together, about family and memories, I couldn't form the words of rejection burning on the tip of my tongue. "It's okay," I said quietly, reaching out and taking the dress from Posey before Taylor could escalate the situation into a full fight. "I'll wear it." The satisfaction that gleamed on Posey's face was palpable and venomous, and she adjusted the designer bag on her shoulder with practiced movement before delivering the final blow. "And Penelope, dear," she said with fake concern that would fool anyone who didn't know her as well as I did, "take off those earrings when you get ready. They're too flashy for someone who's just going as a +1. And that makeup too. Nothing too elaborate. This is a serious event, not a club. We don't want you to look like you're trying too hard." Taylor was red with rage when Posey left, and she turned to me with almost desperate urgency. "You're being absurd!" She practically yelled at the door Posey had just closed. "She's being cruel on purpose, and you know it." "I'm being realistic," I murmured, mentally repeating the justification I imagined Posey would give if anyone questioned her. Maybe she's right. Maybe I really don't fit in that world of hers. Maybe she's just trying to spare me the embarrassment of not belonging. "That's bullshit, and you know it," Taylor said, grabbing my hands tightly. "You don't have to do this. Mom will understand." But Henrietta wouldn't know the real reason, because I wasn't going to tell her about the horrible dress and the cruel intentions behind it, the same way I never told her about all the other small humiliations Posey distributed over the years, with the precision of a surgeon cutting exactly where it would cause the most damage without leaving visible scars. Our mother loved her 3 daughters and sincerely believed we were a functional family with just small, normal complications, and I wasn't going to destroy that illusion of hers just because Posey had decided to use me as a target for her own insecurities. Hours later, I was in my room getting ready for the event, and when I put on the horrible brown dress, the reflection in the mirror confirmed all my worst expectations. The ruffles made my body look misshapen and without defined form. The color left my skin with a sickly and dull tone, and the fit was so deliberately bad it seemed intentional, as if Posey had specifically chosen the ugliest piece from some thrift store specializing in clothes that should have been burned instead of sold. I took off the delicate earrings my grandmother had given me before she died, the small pearls that were one of the few truly valuable things I owned, and put them away in the box with care that the threatening tears made difficult. I wiped off the makeup I'd put extra effort into in the futile hope of compensating for the disaster of the dress, and each small removal seemed to tear away a piece of my dignity along with it, until only the faded and diminished version of myself that Posey wanted to display remained. Taylor was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs when I came down, and she looked beautiful in the simple but well-cut blue dress she'd bought on sale months ago, and the contrast between the two of us was so glaring it was almost comical in its cruelty. She held my hand and whispered, "You look beautiful anyway," with a conviction we both knew was a kind lie, but I squeezed her fingers in silent gratitude for the attempt. Posey's limousine was waiting in front of the house, black and gleaming and absolutely intimidating for someone like me, who drove an old second-hand car and considered Uber an occasional luxury reserved for emergencies. Posey was already sitting in the front seat talking to the driver about the fastest route, using that professional and efficient tone she reserved for work interactions. And when Taylor and I got into the back seat, she barely looked in our direction. The atmosphere inside the car was tense enough to cut with a knife, heavy with everything that wasn't being said, and with the acute awareness that Posey had orchestrated this entire situation as punishment for crimes I didn't even know I'd committed. Posey checked her phone obsessively, making quick calls about event details and confirming commitments with important people, while Taylor held my hand in the back seat and gave me looks of solidarity that made the lump in my throat tighten more. "You look beautiful anyway," Taylor whispered near my ear when we were halfway to the 5-star hotel where the event would be held. her voice low enough that Posey couldn't hear but loaded with sincerity that made my eyes burn. "I look like a curtain," I replied in the same low tone, and Taylor let out a muffled laugh she tried to disguise as a cough when Posey looked through the rearview mirror with irritation. When we arrived at the hotel, and the limousine stopped at the entrance full of photographers and elegant guests, I felt my stomach turn violently with anticipation of what was to come. Posey got out first, stunning in a red dress that probably cost more than my 3-month salary, and that fit her body with the perfection that only obscene money could buy. And the cameras went off immediately capturing her beauty, which was undeniable even when used as a weapon. Taylor got out next, pretty in the blue dress that looked perfect despite its modest price. And then it was my turn to emerge from the limousine like the ugly duckling from a story nobody had asked to witness. I felt the stares sticking to me like a physical substance, some curious and others clearly confused about why someone would wear something so spectacularly hideous to such an elegant event. And each look was a small death of the self-esteem I was trying to keep alive. The event hall was spectacular in an almost obscene way, with crystal chandeliers that seemed to cost more than entire houses and tables, decorated with floral arrangements so elaborate they probably had dedicated teams just to keep them alive during the night. Posey guided us inside with the posture of a queen entering conquered territory, greeting important people with calculated air kisses and smiles that were works of art of sincere fakeness. She introduced Taylor to some of her professional contacts, using that polite and engaged tone she reserved for people who could be useful in climbing the career ladder, asking questions about architecture projects, and feigning genuine interest in answers. But when it was my turn, when someone looked in my direction expecting an introduction, Posey simply ignored me as if I were an inconvenient piece of furniture she'd been forced to bring and now pretended didn't exist. People looked at me with that polite curiosity rich people use when faced with something they can't categorize, clearly wondering who the out-of-place girl in the tacky dress was next to the elegant sisters. Each look was a small needle of humiliation burrowing deeper, and I found myself desperately wishing I'd stayed home with the cats and a good book instead of accepting this public torture. Taylor stayed with me as much as she could, maintaining light conversations about work and weather and other safe subjects that didn't require much from me beyond forced smiles and nods of agreement. But eventually, she needed to go to the bathroom, and when she left, leaving me alone near a column, I felt panic rise in my throat with the awareness of being completely exposed and vulnerable. That's when Posey approached, and she wasn't alone, but accompanied by 2 perfectly made-up and dressed friends who clearly belonged to the same social circle of carefully constructed appearances. They laughed quietly when they saw my dress up close, the sound not exactly discreet, and Posey smiled in that way I knew all too well. "Penelope, dear," she said in a voice that dripped venomous sweetness, and I knew that tone so well that my whole body automatically prepared for the blow that would come. "You should stay near the buffet. I think nobody there will really notice you. It's more discreet, more appropriate for someone in your position." She paused, letting the words hang for a calculated moment, and then the smile transformed into something cruel and satisfied. "Oh, after all," she continued with fake concern that fooled no one, "nobody wants you here. You're just putting yourself in your natural place. Or do I need to spell it out for you to understand?" The words hit with the force of physical violence, stealing the air from my lungs and making hot tears burn behind my eyes with an intensity that became difficult to hold back. Posey's friends laughed louder this time, the sound echoing in the space around us, and making some nearby people look in our direction with curiosity. But I couldn't bring myself to care who was watching because all that existed was the sharp and familiar pain of rejection poisoned with deliberate cruelty. I didn't respond. Didn't trust my voice to come out without breaking completely and giving Posey the total satisfaction of watching me fall apart in public. So I just turned, each movement feeling like moving through thick and heavy water, and walked toward the glass doors leading to the outdoor terrace where maybe I could breathe without feeling like I was drowning. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing while fighting against tears burning to get out, was that Scott Ferrari had watched the entire scene from the other side of the hall, where he was trapped in a tedious conversation with investors who wouldn't stop talking about the real estate market. He knew Posey Sharman very well, had politely declined her progressively less subtle advances at 3 different events in the last 6 months, and each rejection had been received with a forced smile that barely hid the frustration of a woman used to getting what she wanted. Scott had noticed the absolutely horrible dress as soon as I entered the hall, had seen the way Posey deliberately isolated me from conversations, leaving me literally aside like a forgotten object, and something in that cruel dynamic had started to ignite a cold anger in his chest. He hated bullying disguised as social superiority, hated people who used power and status to crush others just because they could, And when he saw Posey approach me with those laughing friends, he had interrupted his own conversation to pay attention. He couldn't hear the exact words Posey said, was too far away to catch the specific venom she distilled, but he saw the way my entire body contracted as if I'd taken a physical blow, saw Posey's friends laughing, saw me turning and walking to the terrace with curved shoulders and lowered head of someone fighting not to cry in public. The anger Scott felt was cold and precise, the kind of controlled fury of a man used to having power and who rarely chose to use it, but when he did, had no mercy. He abruptly excused himself from the conversation about the real estate market, ignoring the confused protests from the investors, and began crossing the hall toward the terrace doors with a determination that made several people instinctively move out of his way. Posey had just made a colossal mistake, and Scott Ferrari was going to take particular pleasure in demonstrating exactly how expensive that mistake would be. I've never written such a complicated sister relationship, and the worst part is that this relationship goes from bad to worse from here on out. Chapter 2. The Rescue and the Dance.
You think she embarrassed you? But she just gave me the perfect reason to step in.
The cold night air hit my face when I stepped onto the terrace, and I took a deep breath, trying to control the tears burning behind my eyes, threatening to collapse all the fragile composure I was still trying to maintain. The terrace was empty, just me and the view of the illuminated city below, and I leaned against the marble railing, feeling the weight of Posey's words crushing my chest, until it became hard to breathe properly. "Terrible party, isn't it?" The voice came from behind me, masculine and casual but kind in a way that made my whole body turn too fast. I almost lost my balance in the uncomfortable heels and found myself face to face with Scott Ferrari. And the recognition was immediate and shocking because everyone knew Scott Ferrari. He was impossible not to recognize, with that presence that filled spaces, and that face that appeared in business magazines and society columns with irritating regularity. I quickly wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, trying to erase evidence of the tears I hadn't let fall yet. "The party's great, actually," I said, in a voice that came out firmer than expected. "I just needed some fresh air." "Terrible liar," he said, approaching the railing and leaning next to me with a casualness that seemed too natural for someone so clearly used to being in control. "I saw your sister being absolutely charming a few minutes ago." The sarcasm was so heavy in his voice it practically had physical weight. I let out a humorless laugh, the sound coming out rough and broken. "Posey's having a bad day," I said, defending my sister even with her cruel words still echoing in my head, because that's what I always did. Scott looked at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see through defenses and masks. "Posey has a bad personality," he corrected without hesitation. "Important difference you should consider." We stood in silence for a moment that stretched comfortable instead of tense, and then Scott started talking about the event with sharp sarcasm that was funny instead of cruel, making observations about the general pretentiousness and the people who donated money mainly to be seen donating. He was surprisingly easy to talk to, had perfect comic timing and a way of making comments that caught me off guard and pulled genuine laughs, even with all the pain still pulsing in my chest. "And that dress," he said eventually, looking at the horrible brown thing covering my body with exaggerated attention. "Absolutely bold design. Vintage." I laughed for real this time, the sound coming out unexpected and liberating. "It's hideous," I admitted without filter. "I know it is. Posey picked it out especially for me." "Ah," Scott said, as if all the pieces of a complicated puzzle had just fallen perfectly into place. "That explains absolutely everything. She has questionable taste in clothes," calculated pause, "and behavior." I found myself telling him about the dynamic with Posey without even noticing how I'd started, the words coming out without the usual filter I maintained about sensitive family matters. I talked about years of small cruelties, about how Posey always seemed to find new ways to diminish me, about how I accepted it because I didn't know how to do differently, and because Henrietta believed we were a functional family. Scott listened to everything without interrupting, just watching my face with attention that made me feel seen in a way I wasn't used to. When I finished, he stayed quiet for a moment, processing, and then that dangerous smile formed on his lips. "You know what people like Posey hate more than anything?" he asked, and there was a promise of delicious trouble in his voice. "What?" I asked, curiosity beating caution. "Losing attention," Scott answered, extending his hand to me. "Come with me." He guided me back to the hall with his hand gentle but firm on my arm, and I could feel eyes sticking to us as we crossed through the glass doors. Taylor saw us first from the other side of the space, and the expression on her face went from concern to absolute shock in seconds, her eyes widening so much they seemed about to fall out while that huge and incredulous smile formed. Posey was a few meters ahead, laughing with the two friends who had witnessed the humiliation earlier, probably still delighting in the cruelty, when Scott stopped directly in front of her. "A Posey," he said, and her name came out like it tasted bad. Always such a special pleasure. My sister turned quickly, wine almost spilling from her glass, and I saw panic flash before the seduction mask formed. "Scott," she practically purred, seductive smile activating instantly. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." It was a lie so obvious that even her friends seemed embarrassed. Scott just smiled with all sharp edges. "I'm sure," he said dryly, and then turned all his attention to me, in a way so deliberate the rejection was impossible not to notice. "You know your sister, Posey, Penelope." He took my hand while speaking, holding it between his, in a way that was too intimate to be casual and too public to be ignored. Posey looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, eyes traveling over the horrible dress before returning to Scott, with barely disguised confusion. "Of course," she said with automatic condescension. "My little sister." The venom in the word made my body contract, but Scott just smiled wider and more dangerously. "Fascinating," he said, and the pause that followed lasted long enough for several nearby people to stop their own conversations, because I was just planning to ask the most interesting woman in this entire hall for a dance. The silence was absolute. Posey's friends stopped laughing. Several people were looking now with curiosity, and Posey froze completely. Scott turned to me, still holding my hand. "Penelope," he said softly and loaded with intention, "would you give me the honor of this dance?" I looked at him completely confused for 2 seconds, brain refusing to process. Then he winked, quick and conspiratorial, that small smile making his intentions clear, social revenge executed with surgical precision. I understood, and something wild inside me that was tired of being humiliated decided that yes, I wanted this. "I'd love to," I said, voice coming out firm as I placed my hand in his. The entire hall seemed to watch as we crossed to the dance floor where slow music began, with perfect cinematic timing. Scott positioned me carefully, hand on my waist respectful but firm, the other holding my hand gently. "Breathe," he said quietly. "Just follow me." "I don't know how to dance," I confessed in panic. "I know," Scott responded with amusement in his voice. "Trust me." We started moving, and I stumbled immediately, almost stepping on him. I stumbled again seconds later. Scott laughed quietly, the sound genuine. "Relax. Everyone's too busy watching your sister having a live aneurysm to pay attention to your feet." I looked, and the sight was worth everything. Posey was red, so red she looked feverish, hands in fists and glass abandoned. Her friends were whispering furiously, looking between Posey and us. On the other side, I saw Taylor with her phone raised, clearly filming, that huge smile on her face, and next to her, a tall man had appeared, who was watching Scott with amusement. "Your friend is a genius," the man said loud enough for Taylor to hear. "My baby sister has been this woman's victim for years," Taylor responded without lowering her phone. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The music continued, and gradually I relaxed enough to not stumble constantly. There was something hypnotic about the way Scott moved, confident and controlled, his hand on my waist being a solid anchor. When the music ended, Scott didn't release me immediately, continued holding me, looking into my eyes with an intensity that made my heart race. "Want to get out of here?" he asked suddenly. "There's an excellent 24-hour cafe 2 blocks away. They make criminally good waffles." "You're taking me away from your own party?" I asked, blinking. "Technically, it's an extremely boring charity party I attend out of obligation," Scott said with total sincerity. "I'd much rather have coffee with you." For the first time all night, the smile that appeared on my face was completely genuine. "Yes," I said, "I'd love to." Scott smiled like I'd given him the best gift and guided me off the dance floor. We passed directly by Posey, and Scott slowed his pace just enough to look at her. "Good night, Posey," he said with glacial politeness. Always an absolute displeasure. Posey opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her friends looked between us and her with obvious embarrassment, and several nearby people tried to disguise that they were watching the drama. Taylor reached us before the door, practically running. "Can I come?" she asked without hiding her enthusiasm. "Obviously," Scott said, as if the question didn't even need to be asked. Taylor was already typing furiously on her phone. She showed me the screen before sending, "We'll Uber back later. Have fun, you and your completely destroyed ego." She hit send, and then the 3 of us left the hotel together, leaving behind the hall full of fresh gossip, and me with my horrible dress that had somehow become the best thing that ever happened in my life. Look how the world turns, right? Our protagonist started the story in a kind of sad situation, and look how everything changed in just 1 chapter, but there's still more to come. Chapter 3, The Coffee and the Connection.
You think this was about revenge, but I don't walk away from something real.
The 24-hour cafe had that 50s American diner aesthetic that seemed to have come straight out of an old movie, with red vinyl seats that creaked when you sat down, and a Formica counter that had clearly seen better days. The waitress looked at us with the expression of someone who'd seen absolutely everything in this life, and nothing surprised her anymore. Not even 4 people arriving at 2 in the morning, with one of them wearing a brown dress that looked like a crime against fashion. Scott guided us to the booth in the corner, and there was something completely surreal about sitting there with him on one side and Taylor on the other, while Alex Moreno settled in next to Scott, picking up the laminated menu with obvious familiarity. I could still feel the adrenaline from the party running through my veins, the memory of Posey's mortified expression too vivid to seem completely real. "Waffles," Scott announced with the seriousness of someone discussing a matter of national importance, "with chocolate syrup, whipped cream, and an absurd amount of strawberries. It's the only morally correct choice in this establishment." "I violently disagree," Alex said without even looking at the menu. "Pancakes with bacon and maple syrup. Unbeatable classic that stands the test of time." Taylor was looking between me and Scott, with that smile I knew all too well. "Chocolate milkshake," she declared, "and fries, because tonight deserves to be celebrated with carbs in medically questionable quantities." The waitress took the orders without blinking, when Scott ordered enough waffles to feed a small army, plus coffee for everyone that she guaranteed was strong enough to resurrect the dead. When she left, the 4 of us were silent for exactly 3 seconds before Taylor exploded in laughter. I still can't believe you actually did that," she said, looking at Scott with admiration that bordered on religious reverence. "Posey's face when you asked Penelope to dance was the most satisfying thing I've ever witnessed in my entire life, including when she fell face first into her own 15th birthday cake." "I filmed everything," Taylor continued, already grabbing her phone and showing the video to Alex, who watched with growing amusement. "Look here. Look at her expression when he says a most interesting woman in the hall. She literally freezes like someone hit universal pause on her life." Scott was smiling in that dangerous way, but when he looked at me, the expression softened. "It wasn't just revenge," he said with a sincerity that made my stomach do a strange knot. "Well, maybe 20% was delicious revenge, but the other 80 was because you looked like you needed someone on your side. The food arrived too fast to be healthy, but smelled incredibly good, and I realized I was starving because I'd spent the entire night with my stomach too twisted to think about eating." Scott pushed the plate of chocolate-covered waffles in my direction along with a fork. "Eat," he ordered with no room for argument. "You spent the night being emotionally tortured by a sister with serious character problems. You deserve sugar as compensation." While we ate, Scott started asking me questions about my life with genuine interest that was disconcerting. I told him about working with 5-year-olds who thought eating glue was a valid culinary experience, about living with Henrietta and Taylor, saving up to eventually get our own apartment, about how my life was extraordinarily ordinary in every possible way. "And you?" I asked eventually, curiosity beating shyness. Being CEO of a hotel empire must be the complete opposite of ordinary. Scott made a face that would have been funny if there hadn't been a layer of real frustration underneath. "I became CEO because my dad got sick and needed to delegate responsibilities, not because I woke up dreaming of spending my life in endless meetings and performative charity dinners," he explained with brutal honesty. "If I could choose freely, I'd be traveling the world and collecting art, instead of pretending to care about market share and quarterly reports that make my eyes bleed from boredom." On the other side of the booth, Taylor had turned completely toward Alex, and the two were talking animatedly about architecture and hotel design, clearly giving me and Scott space to have privacy. I heard fragments of their conversation. "Does your friend always rescue women from cruel sisters at boring parties?" Taylor asked with genuine curiosity. "I've never seen Scott do anything remotely like this," Alex admitted, obvious surprise in his voice. "He usually ignores social drama completely, finds it all too superficial and irritating to get involved. Penelope must be special." My face heated hearing the conversation that clearly wasn't for my ears, and when I looked back at Scott, I discovered he'd also heard because he was smiling in that way that made my stomach flip. "You are," he said simply, "special." The hours passed without me noticing, with conversations flowing naturally and laughter echoing through the empty diner. Scott was funny in a sarcastic and intelligent way, made sharp observations that made me laugh until it hurt, and had a way of making me feel like every word I said was important and worthy of complete attention. Eventually, Scott leaned closer across the table. "Can I ask you something personal?" My heart sped up. "You can. Why do you let Posey treat you that way?" he asked. No judgment in his voice, just curiosity mixed with contained anger. "But why do you accept the humiliations? The question hit deep. Because Henrietta, our mother, loves her, I said finally, words coming out carefully. And families are complicated, sister relationships even more so. And because part of me believes that maybe Posey's right, that I really don't belong in that world of hers. Scott got serious, taking my hand across the table. That's complete bullshit, he said with strong conviction. Oh, you belong anywhere you choose to. Posey's jealous. Of what? I asked, unable to imagine. She's successful, rich, beautiful, and bitter, Scott interrupted. Deeply unhappy despite everything. You're kind, genuine. People naturally gravitate toward authenticity. Posey probably saw that her whole life. Saw boys choose you. Saw people like you without you needing to manipulate. And hated every second of it. No one had ever articulated it that way. I felt something tighten in my chest. Painful but liberating recognition. When I looked at the clock, it was 3 a.m. We need to go, I said, with genuine reluctance. Can I see you again? Scott asked, before I got up. Without the horrible dress, without the terrible sister, just the two of us. Why? I asked confused. You got your social revenge? Posey's humiliated. Mission accomplished. Scott looked at me like I'd said something absurd. It wasn't about revenge, he said. Well, 20% was delicious revenge, I won't lie. But 80% was because you looked like you needed a friend, and because I can't stop thinking about how you laughed when I made that terrible joke about the canapes on the terrace. Those were bad jokes, I said, smiling. The best ones always are, Scott agreed, taking my phone and typing his number in. Text me when you get home. Scott insisted on paying the entire bill despite protests, and drove us home in the limousine. We dropped Alex off first, then Taylor, who hugged me tight, whispering, "He's perfect. Don't mess this up," before getting out. When we arrived at my house, Henrietta was awake and came out confused, seeing the limousine. Scott got out and approached with natural charm. "Scott Ferrari," he said, extending his hand. "Your daughter saved my night from terminal boredom at a pretentious event. Thanks for lending her to me." Henrietta visibly melted, torn between interrogating and maintaining composure. "It's a pleasure," she managed to say. "I didn't know you'd be at Posey's event." In the following days, Scott texted me constantly. It started the next morning with a photo of waffles and "thinking of you" that made my heart jump ridiculously. He sent bad memes, photos of paintings, questions about my day with the kids, and I responded initially hesitant but gradually natural. The following Friday, he invited me to a private art gallery. It wasn't a social event, he explained, just the two of us. The gallery was small and intimate, with soft lighting making the paintings glow. Scott guided me, explaining each piece with genuine passion that was beautiful to witness. "And in this one?" I asked, stopping in front of a canvas that literally looked like just paint splatters with no pattern. "Pollock," Scott said seriously. "Abstract expressionism, revolutionary technique. It looks like paint splatters," I said honestly, covering my mouth horrified. Scott laughed genuinely. "It cost $2 million. Expensive paint splatters then," I corrected, and he laughed more. The chemistry was undeniable, growing with each conversation and shared smile. When we reached the end of the gallery, I was too aware of his proximity. Scott stopped before opening the car door, turning to face me under the soft light of the street lamps. "Can I do something?" he asked, voice low and loaded. "A what?" Instead of answering, Scott leaned in slowly, giving me time to pull away, and then his lips touched mine in a kiss that was soft and tentative and absolutely perfect. It lasted seconds, but when he pulled back, I was breathless. "Can I do that again?" Scott asked, forehead against mine. "Please," I whispered, and when he kissed me again, it was with more certainty that made my world reduce to just the two of us. Chapter 4. The Fallout and the Jealousy.
And this time, you don't get to rewrite the story.
You can't be serious.
The family dinner started tense from the moment we sat down at Henrietta's dining table, with the aroma of the roasted chicken she'd prepared floating through the room, while Taylor served the red wine she'd brought as her contribution to the meal. Posey had arrived a few minutes late, wearing a work suit too expensive for a simple family dinner, and the way she looked at me when she walked in already foreshadowed that the night wouldn't end well. "So," Posey said eventually, cutting the chicken on her plate with movements too precise and controlled to be casual, "I heard interesting rumors about you and Scott Ferrari. Penelope. Taylor mentioned something about you two dating." Taylor almost choked on her wine, and I saw the exact moment she realized she'd said too much during an apparently innocent conversation with our older sister. "I just mentioned they'd been on a few dates," Taylor said defensively. "I didn't think it would be a problem." "Problem?" Posey repeated, her voice rising an octave as she dropped her utensils with force that made the plate ring too loud in the tense silence. Penelope is clearly using Scott to get at me, to humiliate me after that ridiculous event where he decided to make a public spectacle embarrassing me. Henrietta placed her own fork on the table with deliberate care, looking between her 3 daughters with growing confusion. Or maybe, she said in the calm voice she used when she was starting to lose patience, Scott really likes Penelope and you're building a genuine relationship. Impossible! Posey practically spat the word, her face turning red with anger that had been building since the night of the charity gala. She doesn't even dress well. How would someone like Scott Ferrari want someone like her when he could have? Because you gave her that horrible dress, Taylor interrupted, her patience finally running out completely. You chose that tacky thing on purpose to humiliate Penelope in front of everyone. Posey! The silence that fell over the table was absolute and heavy as molten lead. Henrietta turned slowly to Taylor, then to me, and then to Posey with an expression I'd rarely seen on our mother's face. What? She asked, her voice dangerously low. And then Taylor told everything, the words pouring out in a torrent that could no longer be contained. She talked about the horrible brown dress Posey had given as a present, about how she'd ordered me to take off my earrings and makeup, about the deliberate humiliation at the party when Posey isolated me and then delivered those cruel words near the buffet. Each detail Taylor revealed made Henrietta's expression harden more, and I saw the moment when our mother finally understood the extent of what had been happening for years, without her noticing. You humiliated your sister, Henrietta asked, looking at Posey with a mixture of shock and disappointment that was worse than any anger could be. Intentionally? Consciously? Posey tried to compose herself, tried to reach for the justifications she'd prepared for exactly that moment. She didn't belong there, she began, in a voice that tried to be firm, but came out defensive. That was my world, my professional contacts, my reputation on the line. I was just, she's your sister, Henrietta interrupted, hitting her hand on the table with force that made all the plates jump. Family, Posey. How could you do that to your own family? And then, it was like something inside Posey broke completely. Years of carefully repressed resentment exploding outward in words that came out loaded with pain and old anger. Family that always chose me last, she screamed, tears starting to roll down her perfectly made-up face. Every boy I liked preferred Penelope. Every boyfriend I tried to keep ended up looking at her instead of me. Dad always gave her more attention, always found her jokes funny, always defended her when we fought. And you, Posey continued, pointing at Henrietta with a trembling finger, you always took her side when we argued, always blamed me for everything that went wrong between us. I spent my whole life being the mean sister while Penelope was everyone's darling without even trying. Henrietta was pale, processing the words with obvious pain stamped on her face. Because you were cruel, Posey, she responded in a broken voice. Penelope never did anything to deserve the treatment you gave her. I defended who was being hurt. I didn't pick favorites. The revelations continued falling like bombs on the dinner table that had been prepared with so much care. And I sat in silence, feeling the weight of years of dysfunctional family dynamics finally being exposed to the raw and painful light. Henrietta was crying now, realizing she'd failed to see the subtle abuse that had happened for so long, while Posey sobbed with all her makeup smeared and all her carefully constructed composure completely destroyed. I left dinner early that night, unable to bear more of the emotional confrontation, and it was only a few days later that the situation worsened in ways I hadn't foreseen. Scott had invited me to dinner at a fancy restaurant downtown, the kind of place with a dedicated sommelier and a menu that didn't list prices, because if you had to ask, you shouldn't be eating there. And I was wearing one of the beautiful dresses he'd insisted on buying for me after much arguing that I'd eventually given in accepting them as loans. We were in the middle of dessert when Posey appeared out of nowhere, materializing next to our table with a desperate expression. That contrasted violently with the impeccable suit she was wearing. Scott, she said without even looking in my direction, her voice coming out urgent and forcedly professional. We need to talk about important business that can't wait. Scott placed his fork on the table with deliberate care, and when he looked at Posey, his expression was so icy, I felt the temperature around us drop several degrees. And we don't have business, Posey, he said in a voice that left no room for argument. We never have and we never will. But Scott, Posey tried to continue, the desperation becoming more obvious as she realized she was losing control of the situation. Penelope isn't who you think she is. She's... Scott raised his hand, cutting off her words mid-sentence, and the gesture was so authoritative and final that Posey stopped talking instantly. Stop, he ordered, in that CEO voice used to being obeyed without question. I'm not interested in absolutely anything you're going to say. I know Penelope, I know you, and I choose her. I'll always choose her. in any situation, against anyone. Now leave before I call security to remove you from the restaurant." Posey stood still for a moment that seemed to stretch infinitely, her face going through a series of expressions that included shock, humiliation, and impotent anger. And then she turned and left, practically running from the restaurant with her high heels beating noisily on the marble floor. I was trembling when she disappeared, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, trying to control the adrenaline running through my veins. "Are you okay?" Scott asked immediately, the hardness disappearing from his voice and being replaced by genuine concern as he took my hand across the table. "She's so lost," I whispered, still looking in the direction Posey had gone. And even after everything that had happened, I still felt compassion for the sister who had spent so many years hurting me because of her own unresolved insecurities. The weeks that followed were strange and wonderful at the same time, with Scott integrating me completely into his life in ways that made my head spin. He took me to social events where I wore the beautiful dresses he insisted on paying for, and that I'd finally stopped arguing about, introduced me to his circle of friends and professional contacts who treated me with genuine kindness that constantly caught me off guard. Everyone seemed to love the naturalness I brought, the way I laughed at my own lame jokes and made honest observations that broke the usual pretentiousness of those environments. But Posey saw everything through social media that she compulsively checked, saw photos of me and Scott smiling together at elegant events, saw the way he looked at me in the images like I was the only person in the world who mattered. The jealousy that had already consumed her for years reached a critical breaking point, and she made a drastic decision that no one had foreseen. She accepted an international work transfer to her company's London branch, a position that required a minimum commitment of 2 years. Henrietta organized a family dinner to discuss the sudden announcement, and the atmosphere at the table was heavy with everything that had been said and everything that remained unsaid between us. "Why so sudden?" Henrietta asked, looking at Posey with confusion mixed with maternal concern. "You always talked about wanting to stay here building your career at headquarters." "It's an incredible professional opportunity," Posey responded in a carefully neutral voice, but then she looked directly at me and something in her expression broke a little. "And I need distance. From everything. From everyone. From myself, Posey," I said gently, still wanting to fix what was broken between us, even knowing it might be impossible. "You don't need to run away. We can try to really talk, work on things, build a better relationship as sisters." "We can't," Posey interrupted me with painful firmness. "You've always been better than me, at everything, at being kind, at making people like you, at winning attention without needing to manipulate or perform. And I hate you for it, Penelope. I hate you with every part of me, but I also hate myself for hating you. I hate myself for not being able to be like you. I hate myself for all the years I wasted with jealousy instead of working on being a better person. I need to leave and figure out who I am when I'm not constantly comparing myself to you." The night before Posey's flight to London, Henrietta asked to talk with her privately, and I stood outside the partially open door, accidentally overhearing the conversation that unfolded. "I'm sorry for not seeing," Henrietta was saying in a voice loaded with tears and guilt. "For years, I didn't realize the extent of what was happening, didn't understand how you were suffering. I failed as a mother. I failed to protect all my daughters, including you. It wasn't your fault," Posey responded, and for the first time in years I heard her cry for real, not tears of anger or frustration, but deep sobs of genuine pain. "It was mine. It was always my fault, my responsibility, my cruel choices. You didn't fail, Mom. I failed. When you come back," Henrietta said with hope trying to penetrate the sadness, "we'll start over. Real family therapy, honest conversations. We'll build the family we always should have been. Maybe," Posey whispered, "in 2 years, when I'm a better person than I am now, if I can become a better person." What an intense scene. Family arguments always affect me when writing. Chapter 5. The Proposal and the Family.
They tried to make you invisible, but you were always the brightest woman in the room.
6 months after Posey boarded her flight to London, I was sitting on the floor of my kindergarten classroom surrounded by 15 5-year-olds singing off-key happy birthday to the class mascot, a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Carrot, when Scott appeared in the doorway with that smile that still made my heart race even after so much time together. The kids exploded in excited screams because he'd become a regular visitor, always bringing new books or art supplies the school would never have the budget to buy. "Children," I said, trying to control the chaos, as Scott walked in and knelt in the middle of their circle. "Remember what we talked about using our inside voices?" "But Miss Penelope," little Emma protested with all the indignation a 5-year-old could muster. "It's Mr. Scott. He brought that amazing science kit last time. Scott laughed in that genuine way I'd learned to differentiate from the polite laugh he used at social events, and spent the next hour helping the kids with an art project that involved an alarming amount of glue and glitter. Later, after parents picked up all the students, and we were alone tidying the classroom, he casually told me he'd made a massive donation to the school, enough to completely renovate the playground and buy educational materials for the next 3 years. "You didn't need to do that," I said for the 100th time, but I was smiling because I'd already learned that arguing with Scott Ferrari about generosity was a losing battle. "I know," he responded, pulling me close and kissing my forehead with a tenderness that contrasted with the image of ruthless CEO the rest of the world saw. But I wanted to anyway. His family had received me with warmth that still surprised me, especially Scott's mother, who had hugged me at our first meeting and declared I was exactly the type of person she'd always hoped her son would find. "Someone real," she'd said with obvious approval while showing me embarrassing photos of Scott as a child. And not another one of those calculating women who only want the Ferrari name and the bank account that comes with it. Taylor and Alex had made their relationship official a few weeks after me and Scott, and now the four of us had dinner together regularly while Alex and Scott discussed business and Taylor and I laughed at the embarrassing stories we managed to extract from each other about our respective boyfriends. Life had fallen into a comfortable and happy pattern I'd never imagined possible for me. When the invitation to the charity event arrived, I realized with shock that it had been exactly 1 year since that horrible night of the brown dress, and Scott noticed my expression when I looked at the date on the elegant paper. "It's at the same hotel," he said, watching my face carefully. "Same cause, same format. Do you want to go?" "Yes," I answered with certainty that surprised me. "I want to go, but this time I'm choosing the dress." The dress I found was absolutely stunning. Emerald green that shimmered under the lights and fit my body in a way that made me feel beautiful and confident instead of out of place and embarrassed. The hairstylist, Scott, insisted on paying for worked magic, transforming my curls into an elegant updo that looked like it came out of a fashion magazine. And when I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving, I barely recognized the confident woman looking back. The entrance to the hotel was completely different from a year ago, with Scott by my side guiding me through the photographers who fired off cameras capturing the two of us, and the people who stopped to greet us did so with genuine respect instead of malicious curiosity. I was no longer the out-of-place sister wearing a horrible dress, but Scott Ferrari's girlfriend wearing emerald green and smiling with confidence that had been built over months of love and support. The event was at its peak when Scott suddenly asked for the hall's attention, gently tapping his champagne glass with a fork, until the buzz of conversations diminished and all heads turned in his direction. My heart started beating irregularly because I had no idea what he was planning, and the way he smiled at me made something in my stomach tighten with anticipation, mixed with nervousness. "Last year," Scott began in that voice that commanded attention without needing to be loud, "I came to an event similar to this one. I was bored, annoyed at having to attend, counting the minutes until I could leave. And then I met an extraordinary woman who was wearing the absolutely most horrible dress I've ever seen in my entire life." Laughter echoed through the hall, and I felt my face heat violently. But Scott was looking directly at me with so much love in his eyes that the embarrassment transformed into something softer. "That dress," he continued when the laughter died down, "was a deliberate attempt at humiliation. Someone very cruel had given her that horror with the specific intention of making her feel ugly and out of place. But I discovered something important that night. It's impossible to humiliate someone who has a heart like Penelope Sharman's." Then he knelt, right there in the middle of the hall with hundreds of people watching, and the silence that fell was so absolute, I could hear my own heart beating wildly. Tears were already streaming down my face before he even opened the velvet box he pulled from his pocket, revealing a ring that sparkled so much it seemed to capture all the lights from the crystal chandelier above us. "Penelope Sharman," Scott said, and his voice was loaded with emotion he rarely let show in public. "You've completely transformed my life. You taught me about genuine kindness, about patience, about what it's like to truly love someone without games or manipulation. The house that was empty and cold is now full of laughter and light. The mornings that were tedious obligations are now moments I eagerly await, because they mean more time with you, and I can't imagine even a single day of my life without you in it." He paused, swallowing with difficulty, and I saw that his eyes were also glistening wet. "Will you marry me?" he asked finally. "Will you let me spend the rest of my life making you laugh and giving you beautiful dresses to replace that brown horror?" "Yes," I managed to say through the tears that wouldn't stop falling. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." The hall exploded in deafening applause that made the crystal chandeliers vibrate, and in the middle of the noise I heard Taylor screaming, "Finally!" with enthusiasm that made several nearby people laugh. Henrietta was sobbing happily, being consoled by Alex, who was also smiling widely, and when Scott put the ring on my finger and pulled me into a kiss that made the hall applaud even louder, I felt I'd finally found the place where I belonged. In London, Posey was in the small but elegant apartment the company had provided, compulsively checking social media like she'd done obsessively for the last few months. When the video of the proposal appeared in her feed, sent by Taylor with a simple message that said only, "Penelope said yes," she felt the familiar stab of jealousy pierce her chest like it always did. But this time, along with the jealousy, came something different. A small but genuine smile that formed on her lips as she watched the radiant happiness on her sister's face. She typed a message for the first time in months. "Congratulations. You deserve this. Truly. I love you, sister." Penelope's response came almost instantly. "We love you too. Come back when you're ready. There will always be a place for you here. Always was, family." The wedding happened 6 months later, in a small and intimate ceremony in the garden of the house Scott had bought for us, with only close family and dearest friends witnessing the vows we exchanged under an arch of white flowers. Posey didn't come back for the wedding because she still wasn't ready, was still working on herself in intensive therapy she'd finally started. But she sent a gift that arrived 2 days before the ceremony. It was a carefully assembled photo album with images of me and her when we were children, before jealousy completely poisoned the relationship, and the handwritten note that accompanied it said simply, "I'm sorry for everything. For all the years I wasted with cruelty when I could have loved you like the sister you always were. I'm working on myself. I'm trying to become a person who deserves to have you in their life. I love you, sister. P." I cried reading the note, the tears staining the carefully written ink, and Scott held me while I sobbed against his chest. "She'll come back," he murmured into my hair. "People change when they really want to change. You're living proof of that. Look how far you've come since that night on the terrace." "I hope so," I whispered back. "Family is complicated and imperfect, but it's worth fighting for." At the reception, after we cut the cake and danced the waltz I still executed with some difficulty even after months of lessons Scott had insisted on paying for, he asked for the guests' attention to make a toast. "I want to formally thank Penelope's sister," Scott said, raising his champagne glass with a smile that had edges of irony but also genuine gratitude, "for giving her that absolutely horrible dress a year ago. Without that brown horror, I wouldn't have noticed the diamond hidden in the middle of so much falseness and superficiality." Gentle laughter echoed through the garden, and Scott continued with his voice becoming more serious. "I learned an important lesson that night. Never judge a person by the clothes they wear or by superficial circumstances. Judge by the heart. And Penelope has the biggest, kindest, most generous heart I've ever known in my life." When the music started again and we returned to the dance floor, I looked at Scott through the happy tears I couldn't stop shedding. "Thank you," I said quietly, just for him to hear. "For what?" he asked, confused. "For seeing me," I answered simply. "When I was invisible, when I was being humiliated and diminished, you truly saw me." Scott smiled in that way that was only mine, only ours. "It was always impossible not to see you, Penelope. You always shone brighter than anyone else in the room. You just needed the right dress for the rest of the world to notice too." "Horrible dress, you mean," I corrected, laughing through the tears. "In the best dress of my life," Scott said, kissing my forehead, "because it led me to you." 2 years later, Posey returned from London transformed in ways that went far beyond physical appearance. Therapy had changed her fundamentally, had helped deconstruct layers of insecurity and jealousy that had accumulated over a lifetime. And when she showed up at the family dinner Henrietta organized specifically for her return, the apologies she offered were loaded with painful sincerity. "I don't expect forgiveness," Posey said, looking directly at me across the table. "I don't think I deserve forgiveness after years making you feel less than you always were, but I want you to know that I understand now. Jealousy consumed me completely. It destroyed our relationship, destroyed my ability to be happy, destroyed years I could have spent loving you as a sister instead of hating you for qualities I should have admired, and I regret that every single day." I got up from the chair and walked around the table, and when I hugged Posey, she went rigid for a moment before breaking down in my arms. "Family forgives," I whispered in her ear. Always forgives when the regret is real. Shall we start over?" The last scene that was engraved in my memory as perfect happened a few weeks later, with Posey visiting the house Scott and I now shared. She was holding my 6-month-old son, Oliver, with obvious nervousness of someone who'd never held a baby before but was trying very hard to learn. "You're an aunt now," I said, smiling as I watched her make silly faces that made Oliver laugh. "Official part of his family. Always will be." "I don't deserve," Posey started, but I interrupted. "You do," I said firmly. "Everyone deserves a second chance when they truly work to change. You taught me that, Posey, indirectly, through all the suffering. You taught me about forgiveness and about giving people space to grow. Scott appeared in the room carrying coffee for all of us, and when he looked at Posey holding Oliver, he smiled without any malice. I still thank you for the horrible dress, he said casually. It completely changed my life. Posey laughed, tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of relief and joy instead of pain. It was terrible, wasn't it? She asked. Worst dress I've ever seen in my life, Scott confirmed with total sincerity. Absolutely perfect. I looked around the room, at my imperfect and complicated family, but finally, miraculously healed, and felt gratitude so deep it was almost physical. The horrible dress had really changed everything, had started a chain of events that led to this moment of redemption and love and second chances. Sometimes, I thought smiling, the worst gifts lead to the best endings. Behind the scenes. When I started writing this video, I only knew one thing. There would be a girl wearing the most horrible dress possible at an elegant event, and the exact moment when the most coveted bachelor in the room decides she's the most interesting person there. The inspiration came from real stories I've heard over the years about dynamics between sisters, about that silent and destructive jealousy that corrodes family relationships for decades. I wanted to explore how cruelty often comes from deep insecurity, and how genuinely good people continue loving those who hurt them because family is complicated that way. Penelope was easy to write. She's kind without being passive, strong in quiet ways. Scott was more challenging because he needed to be dominant and protective without falling into toxic territory. The secret was making him someone who actively chooses to be kind, who uses power to protect instead of control. But Posey broke my heart. Writing the villain who's also a victim of her own insecurities was painful and necessary. She needed redemption, not because Penelope needed to forgive, but because real people are rarely completely bad. They're wounded, lost, fighting with internal demons. The horrible brown dress became a symbol of all this. Humiliation transformed into the beginning of something beautiful. Sometimes the worst moments lead us to the best destinations. And honestly, I still imagine that dress and laugh. It must have been spectacularly hideous. And if you want to watch another story, click on the video appearing now on your screen.